Chapter 14. The sudden termination of Colonel Brandon's visit at the park, with his steadiness in concealing its cause, filled the mind and raised the wonder of Mrs. Jennings for 2 or 3 days. She was a great wonderer, as every one must be who takes a very lively interest in all the comings and goings of all their acquaintance. She wondered with little intermission what could be the reason of it, and was sure there must be some bad news, and thought over every kind of distress that could have befallen him with a fixed determination that he should not escape them all. "Something very melancholy must be the matter, I am sure," said she. "I could see it in his face, poor man. I'm afraid his countenance may be bad. The estate at Delaford was never reckoned more than 2,000 a year, and his brother left everything sadly involved. I do think he must have been sent for about money matters, for what else can it be? I wonder whether it's so. I'd give anything to know the truth of it. Perhaps it's about Miss Williams, and by the by, I dare say it is, because he looked so conscious when I mentioned her. Maybe she's ill in town. Nothing in the world more likely, for I have a notion she's always rather sickly. I would lay any wager that it's about Miss Williams. It's not so very likely that he'd be distressed in the circumstances now, for he's a very prudent man, and to be sure must have cleared the estate by this time. I wonder what it can be. Maybe his sister's worse at Avignon and has sent for him. His setting off in such a hurry seems very like it. Well, I wish him out of all his troubles with my heart, and a good wife into the bargain." So wondered, so talked Mrs. Jennings. Her opinion varied with every fresh conjecture, and all seeming equally probable as they arose. Eleanor, though she felt really interested in the welfare of Colonel Brandon, could not bestow all the wonder on his going so suddenly away, which Mrs. Jennings was desirous of her feeling. For besides that, the circumstance did not, in her opinion, justify such lasting amazement or variety of speculation. Her wonder was otherwise disposed of. It was engrossed by the extraordinary silence of her sister and Willoughby on the subject, which they must know to be peculiarly interesting to them all. As this silence continued, every day made it appear more strange and more incompatible with the disposition of both. Why they should not openly acknowledge to her mother and herself what their constant behavior to each other declared to have taken place, Eleanor could not imagine. She could easily conceive that marriage might not be immediately in their power, for though Willoughby was independent, there was no reason to believe him rich. His estate had been rated by Sir John at about 600 or 700 a year, but he lived at an expense to which that income could hardly be equal, and he had himself often complained of his poverty. But for this strange kind of secrecy maintained by them relative to their engagement, which in fact concealed nothing at all, she could not account, and it was so wholly contradictory to their general opinions and practice that a doubt sometimes entered her mind of their being really engaged, and this doubt was enough to prevent her making any more inquiry of Marianne. Nothing could be more expressive of attachment to them all than Willoughby's behavior. To Marianne it had all the distinguishing tenderness which a lover's heart could give, and to the rest of the family it was the affectionate attention of a son and a brother. The cottage seemed to be considered and loved by him as his home. Many more of his hours were spent there than at Allenham, and if no general engagement collected them at the park, the exercise which called him out in the morning was almost certain of ending there, where the rest of the day was spent by himself at the side of Marianne and by his favorite pointer at her feet. One evening in particular, about a week after Colonel Brandon left the country, his heart seemed more than usually open to feeling every attachment to the objects around him. And on Mrs. Dashwood's happening to mention her design of improving the cottage in the spring, he warmly opposed every alteration of the place which affection had established as perfect with him. "What!" he exclaimed. "Improve this cottage? No, that I will never consent to. Not a stone must be added to its walls, not an inch to its size, if my feelings are regarded." "Do not be alarmed," said Miss Dashwood. "Nothing of the kind will be done, for my mother will never have money enough to attempt it." "I'm heartily glad of it," he cried. "May she always be poor if she can employ her riches no better." "Thank you, Willoughby, but you may be assured that I would not sacrifice one sentiment of local attachment of yours or of any one whom I loved for all the improvements in the world. Depend upon it that whatever unemployed sum may remain, when I make up my accounts in the spring, I would even rather lay it uselessly by than dispose of it in a manner so painful to you. But are you really so attached to this place as to see no defect in it? I am, he said. To me it's faultless. Nay, more, I consider it as the only form of building in which happiness is attainable. And were I rich enough, I would instantly pull comb down and build it up again in the exact plan of this cottage. With dark, narrow stairs and a kitchen that smokes, I suppose? Said Eleanor. Yes, he cried in the same eager tone, with all and everything belonging to it, in no one convenience or inconvenience about it, should have the least variation be perceptible. Then and then only, under such a roof, I might perhaps be as happy at Combs as I've been at Barton. I flatter myself, replied Eleanor, that even under the disadvantage of better rooms and a broader staircase, you'll hereafter find your own house as faultless as you now do this. There are certainly circumstances, said Willoughby, which might greatly endear it to me, but this place will always have one claim on my affection, which none other can possibly share. Mrs. Dashwood looked with pleasure at Marianne, whose fine eyes were fixed so expressively on Willoughby as plainly denoted how well she understood him. How often did I wish, he added, when I was at Allenham this 12-month, that Barton Cottage were inhabited. I never passed within view of it without admiring its situation and grieving that no one should live in it. How little did I think that the very first news I should hear from Mrs. Smith, when next I came into the country, would be that Barton Cottage was taken, and I felt an immediate satisfaction and interest in the event, but nothing but a kind of prescience of what happiness I should experience from it can account for. Must it not have been so, Marianne? Speaking to her in a lowered voice. Then, continuing his former tone, he said, and yet this house you would spoil, Miss Dashwood? You would rob it of its simplicity by imaginary improvement? And this dear parlor, in which our acquaintance first began, and which so many hours have since been spent by us together, you would degrade to the condition of a common entrance, and everybody would be eager to pass through the room which was hitherto attained with itself with more real accommodation and comfort than any apartment of the handsomest dimensions in the world could possibly afford? Mrs. Dashwood again assured him that no alteration of the kind should be attempted. You're a good woman, he warmly replied. Your promise makes me easy. Extend it a little farther, and it'll make me happy. Tell me that not only your house will remain the same, but that I shall ever find you and yours as unchanged as your dwelling, and that you'll always consider me with the kindness which has made everything belonging to you so dear to me. The promise was readily given, and Willoughby's behavior during the whole of the evening declared at once his affection and happiness. Shall we see you tomorrow to dinner? said Mrs. Dashwood when he was leaving him. I do not ask you to come in the morning, for we must walk to the park to call on Lady Middleton. He engaged to be with him by 4 o'clock. Chapter 15. Mrs. Dashwood's visit to Lady Middleton took place the next day, and 2 of her daughters went with her. But Marianne excused herself from being of the party under some trifling pretext of enjoyment, and her mother, who concluded that a promise had been made by Willoughby the night before of calling on her while they were absent, was perfectly satisfied with her remaining at home. On their return from the park, they found Willoughby's curricle and servant in the waiting at the cottage, and Mrs. Dashwood was convinced that her conjecture had been just. So far it was all she had foreseen, but on entering the house she beheld what no foresight had taught her to expect. They were no sooner in the passage than Marianne came hastily out of the parlor, apparently in violent affliction, with her handkerchief at her eyes, and without noticing them ran upstairs. Surprised and alarmed, they proceeded directly into the room she had just quitted, where they found only Willoughby, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his back towards them. He turned around on their coming in, and his countenance showed that he strongly partook of the emotion which overpowered Marianne. Is there anything the matter with her? Cried Mrs. Dashwood as she entered. Is she ill? I hope not, he replied, trying to look cheerful, and with a forced smile presently added, It's I who may rather expect to be ill, for I now suffer under a very heavy disappointment. Disappointment? Yes, I'm unable to keep my engagement with you. Mrs. Smith has this morning exercised the privilege of riches upon a poor dependent cousin by sending me on business to London. I've just received my dispatches and taken my farewell of Allenham, and by way of exhilaration, I am now come to take my farewell of you. To London? And you're going this morning? almost this moment. This is very unfortunate, but Mrs. Smith must be obliged, and her business will not detain you from us long, I hope." He colored as he replied, "You're very kind, but I have no idea of returning into Devonshire immediately. My visits to Mrs. Smith are never repeated within the 12-month. "And is Mrs. Smith your only friend? Is Allenham the only house in the neighborhood to which you'll be welcome? For shame, Willoughby, can you wait for an invitation there?" His color increased, and with his eyes fixed on the ground, he only replied, "You're too good." Mrs. Dashwood looked at Elinor with surprise. Elinor felt equal amazement. For a few moments every one was silent. Mrs. Dashwood first spoke. "I have only to add, my dear Willoughby, that at Barton Cottage you will always be welcome, for I'll not press you to return here immediately, because you only can judge how far that might be pleasing to Mrs. Smith, and on this head I shall be no more disposed to question your judgment than to doubt your inclination." "My engagements at present," replied Willoughby confusedly, "are of such a nature that I dare not flatter myself—" He stopped. Mrs. Dashwood was too much astonished to speak, and another pause succeeded. This was broken by Willoughby, who said with a faint smile, "It is folly to linger in this manner. I'll not torment myself any longer by remaining among friends whose society it's impossible for me now to enjoy." He then hastily took leave of them all and left the room. Then they saw him step into his carriage, and in a minute he was out of sight. Mrs. Dashwood felt too much for speech, and instantly quitted the parlor to give way in solitude to the concern and alarm which this sudden departure occasioned. Elinor's uneasiness was at least equal to her mother's. She thought of what had just passed with anxiety and distrust. Willoughby's behavior in taking leave of him, his embarrassment and affectation of cheerfulness, and above all, his unwillingness to accept her mother's invitation, a backwardness so unlike a lover, so unlike himself, greatly disturbed her. One moment she feared that no serious design had ever been formed on his side, and the next that some unfortunate quarrel had taken place between him and his sister. The distress in which Marianne had quitted the room was such as a serious quarrel could most reasonably accounted for, though when she considered what Marianne's love for him was, a quarrel seemed almost impossible. But whatever might be the particulars of their separation, her sister's affliction was indubitable, and she thought with the tenderest compassion of that violent sorrow which Marianne was in all probability not merely given way to as a relief, but feeding and encouraging as a duty. In about half an hour her mother returned, and though her eyes were red, her countenance was not uncheerful. "Our dear Willoughby is now some miles from Barton, Elinor," she said, as she sat down to work. "And with how heavy a heart does he travel? It's all very strange, so suddenly to be gone. It seems but the work of a moment. And last night he was with us so happy, so cheerful, so affectionate. And now, after only 10 minutes' notice, gone too without intending to return. Something more than what he owned to us must have happened. He didn't speak, he didn't behave like himself. You must have seen the difference as well as I. What can it be? Can they have quarreled? Why else should he have shown such unwillingness to accept your invitation here? It was not inclination that he wanted, Elinor. I could plainly see that. He had not the power of accepting it. I have thought it all over, I assure you. I can perfectly account for everything that at first seems strange to me as well as to you." "Can you indeed?" "Yes, I have explained it to myself in the most satisfactory way. But you, Elinor, who love to doubt where you can, it will not satisfy you, I know. But you must not talk me out of my trust in it. I'm persuaded that Mrs. Smith suspects his regard for Marianne, disapproves of it, perhaps because she has other views for him, and on that account is eager to get him away, and on that business which she sends him off to transact is invented as an excuse to dismiss him. This is what I believe to have happened. He is moreover aware that she does disapprove the connection. He dares not, therefore, at present confess to her his engagement with Marianne, and he feels himself obliged, from his dependent situation, to give in to her schemes, and absent himself from Devonshire for a while. You'll tell me, I know, that this may or may not have happened, but I will listen to no cavil unless you can point out any other method of understanding the affair as satisfactory as this. And now, Elinor, what can you have to say?" "Nothing, for you have anticipated my answer." "Then you would have told me that it might or might not have happened. Oh, Eleanor, how incomprehensible are your feelings. You had rather take evil upon credit than good. You would rather look out for misery for Marianne and guilt for poor Willoughby than an apology for the latter. You resolve to think him blamable because he took leave of us with less affection than his usual behaviors has shown, and is no allowance to be made for inadvertence or for spirits depressed by recent disappointment. Are no probabilities to be accepted merely because they're not certainties? Is nothing due to the man whom we have all so much reason to love, and no reason in the world to think ill of? To the possibility of motives unanswerable in themselves, though unavoidably secret for a while? And after all, what is it you suspect him of? I can hardly tell myself, but suspicion of something unpleasant is the inevitable consequence of such an alteration as we just witnessed in him. There's great truth, however, in what you have now urged of the allowances which ought to be made for him, and it's my wish to be candid in my judgment of everybody. Willoughby may undoubtedly have very sufficient reasons for his conduct, and I will hope that he has, but it would have been more like Willoughby to acknowledge them at once. Secrecy may be advisable, but still I cannot help wondering at its being practiced by him. Do not blame him, however, for departing from his character where the deviation is necessary. But you really do admit the justice of what I have said in his defense? I'm happy, and he's acquitted. Not entirely. It may be proper to conceal their engagement, if they are engaged, from Mrs. Smith, and if that is the case, it must be highly expedient for Willoughby to be but little in Devonshire at present. But this is no excuse for their concealing it from us. Concealing it from us, my dear child? Do you accuse Willoughby and Marianne of concealment? This is strange indeed, when your eyes have been reproaching them every day for incautiousness. I want no proof of their affection, said Eleanor, but of their engagement I do. I'm perfectly satisfied of both. Yet not a syllable has been said to you on the subject by either of them. I've not wanted syllables where actions have spoken so plainly. Has not his behavior to Marianne and to all of us, for at least the last fortnight, declared that he loved and considered her his future wife, and that he felt for us the attachment of the nearest relation? Have we not perfectly understood each other? Has not my consent been asked daily by his looks, his manner, his attentive and affectionate respect? My Eleanor, is it possible to doubt their engagement? How could such a thought occur to you? How is it to be supposed that Willoughby, persuaded as he must be of your sister's love, should leave her, and leave her perhaps for months without telling her of his affection, that they should part without a mutual exchange of confidence? I confess, replied Eleanor, that every circumstance except one is in favor of their engagement. But that one is the total silence of both on the subject, and with me it almost outweighs every other. How strange this is! You must think wretchedly indeed of Willoughby, if, after all that has openly passed between them, you can doubt the nature of the terms on which they're together. Has he been acting a part in his behavior to your sister all this time? Do you suppose him really indifferent to her? No, I can't think that. He must and does love her, I'm sure. But with a strange kind of tenderness, if he can leave her with such indifference, such carelessness of the future as you attribute to him. You must remember, my dear mother, that I've never considered this matter as certain. I've had my doubts, I confess, but they're fainter than they were, and they may soon be entirely done away. If we find they correspond, every fear of mine will be removed. A mighty concession indeed. If you were to see him at the altar, you would suppose they were going to be married. Ungracious girl, but I require no such proof. Nothing, in my opinion, has ever passed to justify doubt. No secrecy has ever been attempted. All has been uniformly open and unreserved. You can't doubt your sister's wishes. It must be Willoughby, therefore, whom you suspect. But why? Is he not a man of honor and feeling? Has there been any inconsistency on his side to create alarm? Can he be deceitful? I hope not. I believe not, cried Eleanor. I love Willoughby. Sincerely, I love him, and suspicion of his integrity cannot be more painful to yourself than to me. It has been involuntary, and I will not encourage it. I was startled, I confess, by the alteration in his manners this morning. He did not speak like himself. I did not return your kindness with any cordiality. But all this may be explained by such a situation of his affairs as you have supposed. He had just parted from my sister, had seen her leave him in the greatest affliction, and if he felt obliged, from a fear of offending Mrs. Smith, to resist the temptation of returning here soon, and yet aware that by declining your invitation, by saying that he was going away for some time, he should seem to act an ungenerous, suspicious part by our family, be might well embarrassed and disturbed. In such a case, a plain and open avowal of his difficulties would have been more to his honor, I think, as well as more consistent with his general character. But I'll not raise objections against anyone's conduct on so illiberal a foundation as a difference in judgment from myself, or a deviation from what I think right and consistent. You speak very properly. Willoughby certainly does not deserve to be suspected. Though we have not known him long, he is no stranger in this part of the world. And who has ever spoken to his disadvantage? Had he been in a situation to act independently and marry immediately, it might have been odd that he should leave us without acknowledging everything to me at once, but this is not the case. It's an engagement in some respects not prosperously begun, for their marriage must be at a very uncertain distance, and even secrecy, as far as it can be observed, may now be very advisable. They were interrupted by the entrance of Margaret, and Eleanor was then at liberty to think over the representations of her mother, to acknowledge the probability of many, and hope for the justice of all. They saw nothing of Marianne till dinner time, when she entered the room and took her place at the table without saying a word. Her eyes were red and swollen, and it seemed as if her tears were even then restrained with difficulty. She avoided the looks of them all, could neither eat nor speak, and after some time, on her mother's silently pressing her hand with tender compassion, her small degree of fortitude was quite overcome, and she burst into tears and left the room. This violent oppression of spirits continued the whole evening. She was not without power, because she was without any desire of command over herself. The slightest mention of anything relative to Willoughby overpowered her in an instant, and though her family were most anxiously attentive to her comfort, it was impossible for them, if they spoke at all, to keep clear of every subject which her feelings connected with him. Chapter 16. Marianne would have thought herself very inexcusable had she been able to sleep at all the first night after parting from Willoughby. She would have been ashamed to look her family in the face the next morning, had she not risen from her bed in more need of repose than when she lay down in it. But the feelings which made such composure a disgrace left her in no danger of incurring it. She was awake the whole night, and she wept the greatest part of it. She got up with a headache, was unable to talk, and unwilling to take any nourishment, giving pain every moment to her mother and sisters, and forbidden all attempts at consolation from either. Her sensibility was potent enough. When breakfast was over, she walked out by herself and wandered about the village of Allenham, indulging the recollection of past enjoyment and crying over the present reverse for the chief of the morning. The evening passed off in the equal indulgence of feeling. She played over every favorite song that she had used to play to Willoughby, every air in which their voices had been oftenest joined, and sat at the instrument gazing on every line of music that he had written out for her, till her heart was so heavy, and that no farther sadness could be gained, and this nourishment of grief was every day applied. She spent whole hours at the pianoforte, alternately singing and crying, her voice often totally suspended by her tears. In books, too, as well as in music, she courted the misery, which a contrast between the past and present was certain of giving. She read nothing but what they had used to read together. Such violence of affliction, indeed, could not be supported forever. It sunk within a few days into a calmer melancholy, but these employments to which she daily recurred, her solitary walks and silent meditations, still produced occasional effusions of sorrow as lively as ever. No letter came from Willoughby, and none seemed expected by Marianne. Her mother was surprised, and Eleanor again became uneasy. But Mrs. Dashwood could find explanations whenever she wanted them, which at least satisfied herself. "Remember, Eleanor," said she, "how often Sir John fetches our letters himself from the post and carries them to it. We have already agreed that secrecy may be necessary, and we must acknowledge that it could not be maintained if their correspondence were to pass through Sir John's hands." Eleanor could not deny the truth of this, and she tried to find it in a motive sufficient for their silence. But there was one method so direct so simple, and in her opinion so eligible of knowing the real estate of the affair and of instantly removing all mystery, that she could not help suggesting it to her mother. "Why do you not ask Marianne at once," said she, "whether she is or is not engaged to Willoughby? From you, her mother, and so kind, so indulgent a mother, the question could not give offence. It would be the natural result of your affection for her. She used to be all unreserve, and you more especially." "I would not ask such a question for the world. Supposing it possible they're not engaged, what distress would not such an inquiry inflict? At any rate, it would be most ungenerous. I should never deserve her confidence again after forcing from her a confession of what is meant at present to be unacknowledgeable to any one. I know Marianne's heart. I know that she dearly loves me, and I shall not be the last to whom the affair is made known when circumstances make the revealment of it eligible. I would not attempt to force the confidence of any one, of a child much less, because a sense of duty would prevent the denial which her wishes might direct." Eleanor thought this generosity overstrained, considering her sister's youth, and urged the matter farther, but in vain. Common sense, common care, common prudence were all sunk in Mrs. Dashwood's romantic delicacy. It was several days before Willoughby's name was mentioned before Marianne by any of her family. Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, indeed, were not so nice. Their witticisms added pain to many a painful hour. But one evening, Mrs. Dashwood, accidentally taking up a volume of Shakespeare, exclaimed, "We've never finished Hamlet, Marianne. Our dear Willoughby went away before we could get through it. We will put it by that when he comes again, but it may be months, perhaps, before that happens." "Months!" replied Marianne with strong surprise. "No, nor many weeks." Mrs. Dashwood was sorry for what she had said, but it gave Eleanor a pleasure, as it produced a reply from Marianne so expressive of confidence in Willoughby and knowledge of his intentions. One morning, about a week after his leaving the country, Marianne was prevailed on to join her sisters in their usual walk, instead of wandering away by herself. Hitherto she had carefully avoided every companion in her rambles. If her sisters intended to walk on the downs, she directly stole away toward the lanes. If they talked of the valley, she was as speedy in climbing the hills, and could never be found when the others set off. But at length she was secured by the exertions of Eleanor, who greatly disapproved such continual seclusion. They walked along the road through the valley, and chiefly in silence, for Marianne's mind could not be controlled, and Eleanor, satisfied with gaining one point, would not then attempt more. Beyond the entrance of the valley, where the country, though still rich, was less wild and more open, a long stretch of the road which they had travelled on first coming to Barton lay before them, and on reaching that point they stopped to look around them and examine a prospect which formed the distance of their view from the cottage, from a spot which they had never happened to reach in any of their walks before. Amongst the objects in the scene they soon discovered an animated one. It was a man on horseback riding towards them. In a few minutes they could distinguish him to be a gentleman, and in a moment afterwards Marianne rapturously exclaimed, it is he indeed, I know it is," and was hastening to meet him when Eleanor cried out, "Indeed, Marianne, I think you're mistaken. It's not Willoughby. The person's not tall enough for him, and has not his air." He has," cried Marianne. "I'm sure he has. His air, his coat, his horse. I knew how soon he would come." She walked eagerly on as she spoke, and Eleanor, to screen Marianne from particularity, as she felt almost certain of its not being Willoughby, quickened her pace and kept up with her. They were soon within 30 yards of the gentleman. Marianne looked again. Her heart sunk within her, and abruptly turning round, she was hurrying back when the voices of both her sisters were raised to detain her. A third, almost as well known as Willoughby's, joined them in begging her to stop, and she turned round with surprise to see and welcome Edward Ferrars. He was the only person in the world who could at that moment be forgiven for not being Willoughby, the only one who could have gained a smile from her. But she dispersed her tears to smile on him, and in her sister's happiness forgot for a time her own disappointment. He dismounted, and giving his horse to his servant, walked back with him to Barton, whither he was purposely coming to visit him. He was welcomed by them all with great cordiality, but especially Marianne, who showed more warmth of regard in her reception of him than even Eleanor herself. To Marianne, indeed, the meeting between Edward and her sister was but a continuation of that unaccountable coldness which she had often observed at Norland in their mutual behavior. On Edward's side, more particularly, there was a deficiency of all that a lover ought to look and say on such an occasion. He was confused, seemed scarcely sensible of pleasure in seeing him, looked neither rapturous nor gay, said little but what was forced from him by questions, and distinguished Eleanor by no mark of affection. Marianne saw and listened with increasing surprise. She began almost to feel a dislike of Edward, and it ended, as every feeling must end with her, by carrying back her thoughts to Willoughby, whose manners formed a contrast sufficiently striking to those of his brother-elect. After a short silence, which succeeded the first surprise and inquiries of Meeton, Marianne asked Edward if he came directly from London. No, he had been in Devonshire a fortnight. A fortnight, she repeated, surprised at his being so long in the same county with Eleanor without seeing her before. He looked rather distressed as he added that he had been staying with some friends near Plymouth. "Have you lately been in Sussex?" said Eleanor. "I was at Norland about a month ago." "And how does dear, dear Norland look?" cried Marianne. "Dear, dear Norland," said Eleanor, "probably looks as it always does at this time of year, the woods and walks thickly covered with dead leaves." "Oh," cried Marianne, "with what transporting sensation have I formerly seen them fall! How I've delighted, as I walked, to see 'em driven in showers about me by the wind! What feelings they have! The season, the air, altogether inspired. Now there is no one to regard 'em. They are seen only as a nuisance, swept hastily off and driven as much as possible from the sight." "It's not every one," said Eleanor, "who has your passion for dead leaves." "No, my feelings are not often shared, not often understood, but sometimes they are." And as she said this, she sunk into a reverie for a few moments, but rousing herself again, "Now, Edward," she said, calling his attention to the prospect, "here's Barton Valley. Look up to it and be tranquil if you can. Look up at those hills. Did you ever see their equals? To the left is Barton Park, amongst those woods and plantations. You may have seen the end of the house, and there, beneath that farthest hill, which rises with such grandeur, is our cottage." "It is a beautiful country," he replied, "but these bottoms must be dirty in winter." "How can you think of dirt with such objects before you?" "Because," replied he, smiling, "among the rest of the objects before me, I see a very dirty lane." "How strange!" said Marianne to herself as she walked on. "Have you an agreeable neighborhood here? Are the Middletons pleasant people?" "No, not at all," replied Marianne. "We could not be more unfortunately situated." "Marianne," cried her sister, "how can you say so? How can you be so unjust? They're a very respectable family, Mr. Ferris, and towards us have behaved in the friendliest manner. Have you forgot, Marianne, how many pleasant days we've owed to them?" "No," said Marianne in a low voice, "nor how many painful moments." Eleanor took no notice of this, and directing her attention to their visitor, endeavored to support something like discourse with him by talking of their present residence, its conveniences, etc., extorting from him occasional questions and remarks. His coldness and reserve mortified her severely. She was vexed and half angry, but resolving to regulate her behavior to him by the past rather than the present, she avoided every appearance of resentment or displeasure, and treated him as she thought he ought to be treated from the family connection. Chapter 17. Mrs. Dashwood was surprised only for a moment at seeing him, for his coming to Barton was, in her opinion, of all things the most natural. Her joy and expression of regard long outlived her wonder. He received the kindest welcome from her, and shyness, coldness, reserve could not stand against such a reception. They had begun to fail him before he entered the house, and they were quite overcome by the captivating manners of Mrs. Dashwood. Indeed, a man could not be very well in love with either of her daughters without extending the passion to her, and Eleanor had the satisfaction of seeing him soon become more like himself. His affection seemed to reanimate towards them all, and his interest in their welfare again became perceptible. He was not in spirits, however. He praised their house, admired its prospect, was attentive and kind, but still he was not in spirits. The whole family perceived it, and Mrs. Dashwood, attributing it to some want of liberality in his mother, sat down to table indignant against all selfish parents. "What are Mrs. Ferris's views for you at present, Edward?" said she, when dinner was over and they had drawn round the fire. "Are you still to be a great orator in spite of yourself?" "No. I hope my mother is now convinced that I have no more talents than inclination for a public life." "But how is your fame to be established? For famous you must be to satisfy all your family, and with no inclination for expense, no affection for strangers, no profession, and no assurance, you may find it a difficult matter." "I shall not attempt it. I have no wish to be distinguished, and have every reason to hope I never shall. Thank heaven I cannot be forced into genius and eloquence." "You have no ambition, I well know. Your wishes are all moderate." "As moderate as those of the rest of the world, I believe. I wish as well as everybody else to be perfectly happy, but, like everybody else, it must be in my own way. Greatness will not make me so." "Strange that it would," cried Marianne. "What have wealth or grandeur to do with happiness?" "Grandeur has but little," said Eleanor, "but wealth has much to do with it." "Eleanor, for shame!" said Marianne. "Money can only give happiness where there is nothing else to give it. Beyond a competence, it can afford no real satisfaction as far as mere self is concerned." "Perhaps," said Eleanor, smiling, "we may come to the same point. Your competence and my health are very much alike, I dare say, and without 'em, as the world goes, we shall both agree that every kind of external comfort must be wanting. Your ideas are only more noble than mine. Come, what's your competence?" "About 1,800 or 2,000 a year, not more than that." Eleanor laughed. "2,000 a year! One is my wealth. I guessed how it would end." "And yet 2,000 a year is a very moderate income," said Marianne. "A family cannot be well maintained on a smaller. I'm sure I am not extravagant in my demands. A proper establishment of servants, a carriage, perhaps two, and hunters cannot be supported on less." Eleanor smiled to hear her sister describing so accurately their future expenses at Combe Magna. "Hunters?" repeated Edward. "But why must you have hunters? Everybody doesn't hunt." Marianne colored as she replied, "But most people do." "I wish," said Margaret, striking out a novel thought, "that somebody would give us all a large fortune apiece." "Oh, that they would!" cried Marianne, her eyes sparkling with animation, and her cheeks glowing with the delight of such imaginary happiness. "We are all unanimous in that wish, I suppose," said Eleanor, in spite of the insufficiency of wealth. "Oh, dear!" cried Margaret. "Oh, how happy I should be! I wonder what I should do with it." Marianne looked as if she had no doubt on that point. "I should be puzzled to spend so large a fortune myself," said Mrs. Dashwood, "if my children were all to be rich my help." "You must begin your improvements on this house," observed Eleanor, "and your difficulties will soon vanish." "What magnificent orders would travel from this family to London," said Edward, "in such an event! What a happy day for booksellers, music sellers, and print shops! You, Miss Dashwood, would give a general commission for every new print of merit to be sent to you, and as for Marianne, I know her greatness of soul. There would not be music enough in London to content her. And books, Thomson, Cowper, Scott, she would buy 'em all over and over again. She would buy up every copy, I believe, to prevent their falling into unworthy hands. And she would have every book that tells her how to admire an old twisted tree. Should you not, Marianne? Forgive me if I'm very saucy, but I was willing to show you that I had not forgot our old disputes." "I love to be reminded of the past, Edward, whether it be melancholy or gay. I love to recall it, and you'll never offend me by talking of former times. You're very right in supposing how my money would be spent. Some of it, at least. My loose cash would certainly be employed in improving my collection of music and books." "And the bulk of your fortune would be laid out in annuities on the authors or their heirs?" "No, Edward, I should have something else to do with it." "Perhaps, then, you would bestow it as a reward on that person who wrote the ablest defense of your favorite maxim, that no one can ever be in love more than once in their life. Your opinion on that point is unchanged, I presume?" "Undoubtedly. At my time of life, opinions are tolerably fixed. It's not likely I should ever now see or hear anything to change 'em." "Marianne is as steadfast as ever, you see," said Eleanor. "She is not at all altered. She's only grown a little more grave than she was." "Nay, Edward," said Marianne, "you need not reproach me. You're not very gay yourself." Why should you think so? Replied he with a sigh. But gaiety was never a part of my character. Nor do I think it was part of Mary Ann's, said Eleanor. I should hardly call her a lively girl. She's very earnest, very eager in all she does, sometimes talks a great deal, and always with animation, but she's not often really merry. I believe you're right, he replied, and yet I always set her down as a lively girl. I frequently detected myself in such kind of mistakes, said Eleanor, in a total misapprehension of character in some point or other, fancying people so much more gay or grave or ingenious or stupid than they really are, and I can hardly tell why or in what the deception originated. Sometimes one is guided by what they say of themselves, and very frequently by what others say of them without giving oneself time to deliberate and judge. But I thought it was right, Eleanor, said Marianne, to be guided wholly by the opinion of other people. I thought our judgments were given us merely to be subservient to those of neighbors. This has always been your doctrine, I'm sure. No, Marianne, never. My doctrine has never aimed at the subjection of the understanding. All I've ever attempted to influence has been the behavior. You must not confound my meaning. I'm guilty, I confess, of having often wished you to treat our acquaintance in general with greater attention, but when have I advised you to adopt their sentiments or conform to their judgments in serious matters? You may not have been able to bring your sister over to your plan of general civility, said Edward to Eleanor. Do you gain no ground? Quite the contrary, replied Eleanor, looking expressively at Marianne. My judgment, he returned, is all on your side of the question, but I'm afraid my practice is much more on your sister's. I never wish to offend it, but I'm so foolishly shy that often I seem negligent when I'm only kept back by my natural awkwardness. I have frequently thought that it must have intended by nature to be fond of low company. I'm so little at my ease among strangers of gentility. Marianne has not shyness to excuse any inattention of hers, said Eleanor. She knows her own worth too well for false shame, replied Edward. Shyness is only the effect of a sense of inferiority in some way or other. If I could persuade myself that my manners were perfectly easy and graceful, I should not be shy. But you would still be reserved, said Marianne, and that is worse. Edward started. Reserved? Am I reserved, Marianne? Yes, very. I don't understand you, replied he, coloring. Reserved? How? In what manner? What am I to tell you? What can you suppose? Eleanor looked surprised at his emotion, but trying to laugh off the subject, she said to him, Do not you know my sister well enough to understand what she means? Do not you know she calls every one reserved who does not talk as fast and admire what she admires as rapturously as herself? Edward made no answer. His gravity and thoughtfulness returned to him in their fullest extent, and he sat for some time silent and dull. Chapter 18. Eleanor saw with great uneasiness the low spirits of her friend. His visit afforded her but a very partial satisfaction, while his own enjoyment in it appeared so imperfect. It was evident that he was unhappy. She wished it were equally evident that he still distinguished her by the same affection which once she had no doubt of inspiring, but hitherto the continuance of his preference seemed very uncertain, and the reservedness of his manner towards her contradicted one moment what a more animated look had intimated the preceding one. He joined her and Marianne in the breakfast room the next morning before the others were down, and Marianne, who was always eager to promote their happiness as far as she could, soon left them to themselves. But before she was halfway upstairs, she heard the parlor door open, and turning around, was astonished to see Edward himself come out. I'm going into the village to see my horses, said he, and as you're not yet ready for breakfast, I shall be back again presently. Edward returned to him with fresh admiration of the surrounding country. In his walk to the village, he had seen many parts of the valley to advantage, and the village itself, in a much higher situation than the cottage, afforded a general view of the whole, which had exceedingly pleased him. This was a subject which ensured Marianne's attention, and she was beginning to describe her own admiration of these scenes, and to question him more minutely on the objects that had particularly struck him, when Edward interrupted her by saying, You must not inquire too far, Marianne. Remember, I have no knowledge in the picturesque, and I shall offend you by my ignorance and want of taste if we come to particulars. I shall call hills steep, which ought to be bold, surfaces strange and uncouth, which ought to be irregular and rugged, and distant objects out of sight, which ought only to be indistinct through the soft medium of a hazy atmosphere. You must be satisfied with such admiration as I can honestly give. I call it a very fine country. The hills are steep, the woods seem full of fine timber, and the valley looks comfortable and snug, with rich meadows and several neat farmhouses scattered here and there. It exactly answers my idea of a fine country because it unites beauty with utility. And I dare say it's a picturesque one, too, because you admire it. I can easily believe it to be full of rocks and promontories, gray moss and brushwood, but these are all lost on me. I know nothing of the picturesque. I'm afraid it's but too true, said Marianne. But why should you boast of it? I suspect, said Eleanor, that to avoid one kind of affectation, Edward here falls into another, because he believes many people pretend to more admiration of the beauties of nature than they really feel, and is disgusted with such pretensions. He affects greater indifference and less discrimination in viewing them himself than he possesses. He is fastidious, and it will have an affectation of his own. It's very true, said Marianne, that admiration of landscape scenery has become a mere jargon. Everybody pretends to feel and tries to describe with the taste and elegance of him who first defined what picturesque beauty was. I detest jargon of every kind, and sometimes I've kept my feelings to myself, because I could find no language to describe 'em in but what was worn and hackneyed out of all sense and meaning. I'm convinced, said Edward, that you really feel all the delight in a fine prospect which you profess to feel, but in return, your sister must allow me to feel no more than I profess. I like a fine prospect, but not on picturesque principles. I do not like crooked, twisted, blasted trees. I admire them much more if they're tall, straight, and flourishing. I do not like ruined, tattered cottages. I am not fond of nettles or thistles or heath blossoms. I have more pleasure in a snug farmhouse than a watchtower, and a troop of tidy, happy villages please me better than the finest banditti in the world. Marianne looked with amazement at Edward, with compassion at her sister. Eleanor only laughed. The subject was continued no farther, and Marianne remained thoughtfully silent, till a new object suddenly engaged her attention. She was sitting by Edward and taking in his tea from Mrs. Dashwood. His hand passed so directly before as to make a ring, with a plait of hair in the center very conspicuous on one of his fingers. I never saw you wear a ring before, Edward, she cried. Is that Fanny's hair? I remember her promising to give you some, but I should have thought her hair had been darker. Marianne spoke inconsiderately what she really felt, but when she saw how much she had pained Edward, her own vexation at her want of thought could not be surpassed by his. He colored very deeply, and giving a momentary glance at Eleanor, replied, Yes, it's my sister's hair. The satin always casts a different shade on it, you know. Eleanor had met his eye and looked conscious likewise. That the hair was her own, she instantaneously felt as well satisfied as Marianne. The only difference in their conclusion was that what Marianne considered as a free gift from her sister, Eleanor was conscious must have been procured by some theft or contrivance unknown to herself. She was not in a humor, however, to regard it as an affront, and affecting to take no notice of what had passed. By instantly talking of something else, she internally resolved henceforth to catch every opportunity of eyeing the hair and of satisfying herself beyond all doubt that it was exactly the shade of her own. Edward's embarrassment lasted some time, and it ended in an absence of mind still more settled. He was particularly grave the whole morning. Marianne severely censured herself for what she had said, but her own forgiveness might have been more speedy had she known how little offense it had given her sister. Before the middle of the day, they were visited by Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, who, having heard of the arrival of a gentleman at the cottage, came to take a survey of the guest. With the assistance of his mother-in-law, Sir John was not long in discovering that the name of Ferris began with an F and this prepared a future mine of raillery against the devoted Eleanor, which nothing but the newness of their acquaintance with Edward could have prevented from being immediately sprung. But as it was, she only learned from some very significant looks how far their penetration, founded on Margaret's instructions, extended. Sir John never came to the Dashwoods without either inviting them to dine at the park the next day or to drink tea with them that evening. On the present occasion, for the better entertainment of their visitor, towards whose amusement he felt himself bound to contribute, he wished to engage them for both. "You must drink tea with us tonight," said he, "for we shall be quite alone, and tomorrow you must absolutely dine with us, for we shall have a large party." Mrs. Jennings forced the necessity. "And who knows but you may raise a dance," said she, "and that'll tempt you, Miss Marianne." "A dance!" cried Marianne. "Impossible! Who's to dance?" "Who? Why, yourselves and the Careys and Whittakers, to be sure. What, you thought nobody could dance because a certain person that shall be nameless is gone?" "I wish with all my soul," cried Sir John, "that Willoughby were among us again." This, and Marianne's blushing, gave new suspicions to Edward. "And who is Willoughby?" said he in a low voice to Miss Dashwood, by whom he was sitting. She gave him a brief reply. Marianne's countenance was more communicative. Edward saw enough to comprehend not only the meaning of others, but such of Marianne's expressions as had puzzled him before, and when their visitors left him, he went immediately round her and said in a whisper, "I have been guessing. Shall I tell you my guess?" "What do you mean?" "Shall I tell you?" "Certainly." "Well, then, I guess that Mr. Willoughby hunts." Marianne was surprised and confused, yet she could not help smiling at the quiet archness of his manner, and after a moment's silence said, "Oh, Edward, how can you? But the time will come, I hope. I'm sure you'll like him." "I do not doubt it," replied he, rather astonished at her earnestness and warmth. For had he not imagined it to be a joke for the good of her acquaintance in general, founded only on a something or nothing between Mr. Willoughby and herself, he would not have ventured to mention it.